Before we get started, just a quick update for the podcasting community in academia and higher education. Higher Ed PodCon is in Cleveland in July this summer. And for year 2, we've expanded to 2 full days of sessions, conversations, and practical discussions focused entirely on podcasting in higher education. We have over 30 speakers lined up from the US, Canada, UK, and even Italy. I am really excited about the diversity of voices from a broad range of institutions speaking at PodCon this summer. We have our full list of sessions on the website. Early registration is still open. We've worked really hard to keep the cost of attending as reasonable as possible. Registration actually includes breakfast and lunch both days. And you'll see we've negotiated some super affordable hotel rates nearby. So please join us July 16th and 17th. You can learn more and register at higheredpodcon.com, higheredpodcon.com. Hope to see you there.
Participatory research is all about breaking down barriers and creating research that has the potential to be transformative. And through this process, we started to think about the podcast as a space of exploration, a space of discussion, a space where we bring ourselves into it and we think together and we learn from that. And through that broadcast, we enable others, hopefully, to learn with us through that process. So coming back to this idea of gatekeeping, I think podcasting offers something really exciting in terms of participatory research because, again, it can be a key to a door that opens you onto the world. And that's scary. And we had to think a lot about ethics and trust and consent and editing. But actually, it does allow you to get out to tell the world what you do in these museum spaces. So I think gatekeeping is a really important word.
Welcome to Continuing Studies, a podcast for higher education podcasters who want to learn, connect, and get inspired. I'm Neil McPhedran, founder of higheredpods.com and Podium Podcast Company.
I'm Jennifer Lee, founder of JPod Creations. If you're podcasting in higher ed, you're not alone. There's a fast-growing community out there, and we're here to help you tap into it.
We are Jen. Speaking of community, we've talked about this on the last couple of episodes, but where's Jen and Neil? We are going to be coming to you in June. I'm at EPOD, which is very appropriate for this episode we're about to get into. That's in Leeds, and that's in late June.
Yeah, you're speaking.
I'm actually going to be presenting my abstract. And then in July, we're together at Higher Ed PodCon in Cleveland, and we are recording there. So reach out.
Hopefully do a live as well.
There's a podcast studio there, and we'd love to get into the studio with you and turn it into an episode. So give us a shout, reach out to us. Contact information is in the show notes. Okay. So Jen, in this episode, we're chatting with Abigail Harrison Moore, who is a professor from the University of Leeds School of Fine Art, History of Art, and Cultural Studies. And she is also part of what's called the Preservation Party, which is a group of young curators at Leeds City Museum. And that's all about empowering young people to break down traditional barriers and influence the way museum exhibitions and events are curated and presented. I mean, I learned so much from all these, but I actually learned about this whole new thing called participatory research, which we're about to get into. And Abigail's going to explain it a little bit for us.
Yeah, I even learned things on our pre-chat, which isn't recorded. Like I learned that wild rice isn't rice. So
there you go.
Abigail is teaching us many different things. So let's get into it.
Abigail, it's so great to have you here on another episode of Continuing Studies.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really delighted to be speaking to you both today.
Wonderful. So let's start with Whose Power, which is the name of the podcast project. And what is the project and how did it come together?
Okay, so I'm a storyteller, so forgive me if I'm going to tell you a little story. So to try and do this quickly, Whose Power is a project that I co-developed with the Preservative Party, who are a group of 14 to 24-year-olds in Leeds. So they work together with Leeds City Museum. So Leeds is a small city in the north of England. We have a council-run museum service, which is quite unusual still in the UK. So that means taxpayers pay for it. And obviously, as a result, it has an absolute duty and also an amazing history of reaching out to its communities within the city. So the Preservative Party have worked in one form or another with Leeds City Museum for the last 12 years, which is very unusual because most youth projects in museums tend to be start and finish. You get some money, you develop a group, and then they go away. Whereas Leeds City Museum committed to this group, and every week they meet from 5 to 7 at the museum. So I came across them because I've worked with the museum service for the last 30 years since I started my academic career working on a placement at one of the other museums called Lotherton Hall. But I'd never worked with the Preservative Party. And having spent 30 years at the University of Leeds, thinking very much about museum studies. I'm a professor of art history museum studies now. I started off as just a person coming into museums, and now here I am as a professor of museum studies, but also thinking a lot about the fact that it's still, well, it's even more difficult for young people from a state school, so a publicly funded school background in the UK, to access university. I'm a Yorkshire girl by background. I went to a state school. Universities were unusual spaces for me when I went there. And then when I arrived as an academic at Leeds University, I realised I was quite unusual in that environment. So for a very long time, I've been working to engage young people in higher education. So the Preservative Party offered me an opportunity to bring that side of my life together with the other side of my life, which is as a researcher. I think about the late 19th century. I think about the arts and crafts movement, and have been thinking a lot with a group of academics across the world about women making energy change in the 1880s. So up until about 2021, when we published the book, I was an old-fashioned researcher in many ways. I went to archives, I read text, I wrote books, tried to find new ways of thinking about the past, but I've never connected that to my work with young people. And so Whose Power has been a project that has allowed me to bring those two things together: interest in histories of energy, who's talked about in the histories of energy, who's not, and my real interest in engaging young people to help them believe in themselves as researchers and as thinkers and as voices.
And I love that you're kind of taking away the gatekeeping aspect as well. Like when I was listening to it, a lot of the young speakers were saying like, I went into the museums and there are a lot of older people and it's a cold environment. And then they were like, well, it was kind of a misconception because that's what it wasn't. So you're kind of like peeling back and including everybody.
I think gatekeeping is a really interesting word. And thank you for listening to our podcast. Podcasting for us was an experiment. It was something that very much came from the young people. So when I joined the group, it was a really slow process of them getting to know me. And that was really important. I represented this very strange thing. So for them to open the gate to me was really important. And I'm a professor. What does that mean to a group of kids who formal education in the UK failed them for multiple different reasons? They had failed to complete their education. It might be because they were homeless. It might be because of their history, their neurodiversity, but the system had let them down. And then I, in many ways, represented the system. So the first part of the process was them opening the gates to me and allowing me to get to know them and get to know the work that they're doing. They would talk about themselves, and they do on the podcast as activists. One of the fantastic things that Leeds Museums have done with this group is enabled them to really see themselves as people who have a very important voice and can make change. So just when I arrived to work with the group, they've done this incredible exhibition called Overlooked, which they talk about on the podcast. And Overlooked was about them looking at the collections in Leeds, so these millions of objects that we have that represent our history from the 19th century through to the present day, and go, where am I within these objects? And so this exhibition allowed them to talk about neurodiversity, trans identity, gender, race, age, class within the museum. And that was a really daring but really exciting thing for a museum to do and for this group to do, to put themselves forward and out there. So through getting to know them, we talked a lot about what I do as an academic and writing, and we kind of talked about all the problems I have with that notion of the individual researcher sitting in a space and then telling the world what I think. And so through those conversations, we started talking about podcasting. And to be honest, I knew nothing about podcasting. As I said to them at the time, is it like listening to radio? And I like listening to different voices telling me different things that I didn't expect to know about. And so we talked about podcasting, and they said to me, voice is all we have often. The economics of society, education systems have silenced them in many ways, and their voice is important. And so the podcast is something that they saw already that if given the right support, they could learn to do themselves. One of the beauties of podcasting is you can do it with a phone, with a computer, in your bedroom, and you can tell the world what you think. And so we started having a long conversation, and I was very lucky that my funders allowed me, because I said to them, this is participatory research. I don't know what we're going to produce. So when they said, I want to do this, I went back to my funders and went, this is what they want to do. Is that okay? And they said, yes. So we brought in an organization called Research Podcasts. Chrissy and Chris, they really got to know the group because it's a really important part of our process. They then ran a brilliant training session with the group where they really came to them. They talked about the fact that we've changed what they understand a podcast to be and what they understand as the potential of what happens in the podcast studio, because often they've been employed brilliantly by researchers to kind of create a podcast that's like a book. But through this process, we started to think about the podcast as a space. So coming back to this idea of gatekeeping, I think podcasting offers something really exciting in terms of participatory research, because again, it can be a key to a door that opens you onto the world. And that's scary. And we have to think a lot about ethics and trust and consent and editing. But actually, it does allow you to get out to tell the world what you do in these museum spaces. So I think gatekeeping is a really important word.
I think that's a really interesting lens to put on it. We had a chat before we had our interview here, and you really opened my eyes, and I've kind of dug into this participatory research more. But I think it's really interesting how you describe the podcast studio as more than a recording place. It's a participatory space. So what do you think changes once people get in there? Like once the students get in there, once you get in there too, because you're saying this is newer to you too.
Yeah, no, and I think we had to do a lot of work together, which is how we approach everything. Participatory research is all about breaking down barriers and creating research that has the potential to be transformative. And the Preservative Party, as a group of young people, have the potential to be transformative if only we can enable the world to know. And so I think one of the most important things was the work that we did before we went into the studio. So we're very lucky at Leeds. We created a few years back a digital education space called Helix. And when I started talking to the group about a podcast, that was at the very earliest phases of us trying to understand as a university what this digital education space could be, what its potential was. And I was very lucky that they were very open to a conversation. They hadn't decided. So they created podcast studios, but they hadn't really thought beyond students at the university and academics at the university using those. But as a university, we're a big university, huge university, 40,000 students in a very small city. And therefore, we're really alert to what some people call our civic role. And so what we wanted to experiment with what happens when we open those spaces. And again, coming back to this idea of gatekeeping, open them to communities within the city. And interestingly, through this process, a large number of the group have decided to go into further and higher education, which is really exciting given their background. And we're just trying to think together at the moment about what made the difference. And I think it's about meeting a professor, demystifying that. And I think it was being a studio on a university campus. So the team there made it very safe. We worked on a Saturday, so we could have the space to ourselves, which was really important. We recorded the episodes back to back. And one of the things that we talked about with Research Podcast beforehand was their method, and I completely understood that in the past, of being you write a script. You really decide before you go into the podcast studio, because researchers like this. Whereas I said, and the group said, we don't know what we're going to talk about. We have no idea until the space. So my job across the first series was to try and weave together the key themes that were coming out as we recorded, because those key questions, those key research insights that participatory research generates, and you have to sort of catch them in some way. And this is one of the problems for participatory research is, you can have photography, you can have film, but you don't want to stop the process. You don't want to go, wait, everybody, I've got this amazing insight, or you've got this amazing insight. Let's write this down. Let's record this. So the beauty of podcasts, how we've discovered it, having created a safe space to go in, an ethical space to go in, and a space where we said to them, you will get to edit this. you will have the final say-so about what gets translated. And we did a lot of work, a lot of careful work post-production to help them feel safe that they knew what they were going to tell the world. But through that process, those really important research insights as to what made the difference, both about the research process, but also about podcasting, revealed in this very fluid way. So, for example, we thought about pauses, accents. I live in the north of England. My ex-husband can tell you from an accent which town someone comes from. And class is something that's really challenging in academia, in higher education, and yet it's something that you don't see. You hear class difference, you hear accents, and that's what you hear in the podcast. It also allowed us to capture the nuances of their voices. So the idea that for one young person, they'd speak quite quickly and their ideas would come quickly, and for others, it was a much slower process, but that really thoughtful process. And again, pauses, the sounds. That's what the podcast studio has brought to participatory research to allow us to have a much more rounded understanding of who's in the space and how the research is operating. So that's where the podcast studio became a participatory space in a way that none of us predicted, which is why we did the second series, where we more consciously reflected on what was it about podcasting.
I love what you said about accents, because it's something that I didn't think about, because I obviously I understand little bits of differences of English accents, but to me that wouldn't have been a thing. But now you're opening it up to like a larger field where people can just be themselves and not have to worry about how they're going to be perceived.
In participatory research, you've got to be really aware of yourself. I think sometimes there's a perception that, we eat crisps, we make zines, we design exhibitions. It's fabulous. It's fun, and we laugh, and we have fun, and we have parties, and we celebrate. But it's really hard work. It's really hard work. It's the hardest academic work I've ever done. It's the most rewarding academic work I've ever done. But when you go into a classroom with students, you've got to bring yourself to it, and that's exhausting, but it's also brilliant. And my daughter, who's the same age as a lot of the press party, said to me, after I started working with them, your sparks come back on, Mum, because I've been a senior leader at the university. And while that was great, when you step down from a senior leadership role and you think, well, what next? Then I could not have anticipated the impact of, and actually after the first recording, so we'd recorded over Saturday and Sunday back to back, and it was exhausting, but I sat in the car afterwards and I sobbed. And I was like, what am I doing? Why am I sobbing? I'm not a natural crier. And it was because we'd all brought so much into that space. And I needed a release. Yeah. Cool. So I think there's something, again, about that emotional intensity of a microphone and a person and a conversation that podcast captures in a way that no other research output or text or ed can capture.
And there's really no barrier to entry. Like, again, you don't have to worry about how you look on the microphone. You just can get a microphone and start chatting. And that being said, though, are you guys leaning towards eventually doing video, or are you going to keep it completely audio?
No, I mean, this is something that we thought very carefully about. So we have done film and we have a documentary, because, again, that's another process. But the reason I say no emphatically is I think that I have a problem with podcasting becoming a video medium as well. And you're seeing that a lot in professional and public and popular podcasting. I think there's something really special about the voice. And I think it's what broadcasters in the late 19th century, the early 20th century, as we started to discover the medium of radio, really understood, because we listen differently. One of the things I think we're all aware of when we're doing Teams calls or Zoom calls. I mean, I don't know about you, but I check my hair quite a lot, thinking, did my earrings match, etc. Whereas when you're just speaking and listening, there's an intensity to that process that really allows you to hear. And what I guess we all wanted from the podcast was for our audiences to really hear, because what these young people have to say is so important, and to give these young people the respect that they deserve to be listened to. And I think, video wouldn't work for us. And I don't think video works for a lot of podcasting. I think we shouldn't mix up the medium. Sorry. probably a bad thing to say.
I agree. Jen totally agrees.
You have to listen to this all the time because I don't think you should be forced into video. I think, yes, some podcasts can be video and some things work for some people and some things don't.
Yeah, I really appreciate audio only, but especially with what you're doing and for participatory research and how video just it just takes it in a completely different direction and complicates it and whatnot. So if someone in higher education wants to start trying this, as in using podcasting for participatory research, what are some of the non-negotiables that you would sort of suggest before you hit record?
Okay. I think, so one of the things that we do in the second series, and this was very much their decision, because what's interesting in the second series is they built the confidence. So they become the presenters. In the first series, they wanted me to present. In fact, they did one episode where they interviewed me. But in the second series, they said categorically, nah, you're not doing that. We're going to lead on that. But they wanted me at the end of each episode to kind of draw together my research findings to try and translate that, because they were really alert to the fact they wanted academics to get a lot out of it. I think one of the things they want everybody to know, and one of the things I want everybody to know, is that you cannot come at this easily or lightly. It's not easy, and it takes a lot of work and a lot of pre-preparation. So I think I came into this quite naively when I started the project, and now in reflection, I think what we were doing at the beginning was first-person action research, second-person action research, because of the nature of funding, I'd come into the room having set the parameters already. I'd set the research questions because I'd had to say to the research council, this is what we're going to do. And while I was careful with the support of brilliant colleagues at work who helped me write the application to say, I don't quite know what we're going to do. But of course, to get the money, I had to be persuasive. I had to convince the peer reviewers that there was a structure. The second series, I would say, was far more participatory because that was the group co-designing absolutely from the beginning. What are we going to do? Why are we going to do it? What are the research questions we're going to ask? And what enabled us to do that was that very long, slow process of learning about each other. We could not have gone into that studio without the trust that they had in me and I had in them, and we had in research podcasts. You know, Chrissy and Chris had really come to them. Chrissy's got a background as a teacher. They'd really come to the group and learn with the group. Same with Andy, our photographer, Sally, our filmmaker. All of these people, I said to them, yes, I'd like to employ you on this project, but the group gets final say. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. My biggest advice to somebody thinking, this sounds great and that's brilliant. The whole point of going out into the world is to say to other people, this is how research should happen. This is how research in museums should happen. And for me as an historian, I'm consistently interested in, why does it matter that we know about the past? History matters because history helps us thinking about who's been overlooked in history and why they've been overlooked. And those power structures helps us really have a conversation about who matters now and who should matter in the future. But in order to do that, and in order to do this participatory practice, which I thoroughly encourage people to think about, one, you have to be the sort of person who wants to do it. You know, we all know as academics, you have to be really self-aware. You have to work out what your strengths are. And I am not good at being locked in a room and told to write a book. In a classroom, when I can say to students, what do you think? Did that make sense? That's a natural situation for me. Whereas being one of those people that sits down and writes a book and goes, the world must know this. That's not me. But likewise, there are brilliant academics out there who probably should never, ever consider participatory practice because it takes a skill set and it takes a wish to want to learn together, but also to do the hard work. You know, it's great fun, but it's also really hard work for all of us. You know, I am so grateful to the Preservative Party because they bring themselves fully to this. And they live lives and then they come into this space and they give it energy. So I think my advice is there's processes and we've got to get those right. Yeah, ethics, consent.
Yeah, it seems like it's just sort of like a free for all, but that's the completely opposite. Like you're not just sort of like all piling into a room and let's turn on the system and the mics and here we go.
No, if you think that, just don't do it because that's dangerous.
Right.
And it's unfair. and it's extractivist and it's wrong. I get very cross when I see projects where I feel that they were on behalf of the academic, and they were not about who the people were that you're working with, and it will fail to do it. It takes a lot of hard work on behalf of everybody to create the safe space and the trust that enables you then to do a really exciting participatory podcast. And, really good research, really hard work. But when you put the labor in, you have the potential to change the world. And coming back to what Freire said about participatory action research, it's transformative.
Yeah, that's great.
You just said so much in there, and I'm really enjoying our time. So for higher ed podcasters listening, what are they missing if they only use podcasts to communicate research instead of doing research this way?
Research is the worst thing we can do is present research as a smooth, perfectly formed process. Because if we do that, we make it really inaccessible. No, our job as academics is to make our research and our education as accessible as possible. That's what we're paid to do. That's why people give us research grants. That's why we get salaries. And therefore, we should be in an environment where we want to understand the impact of what we're doing and learn from it. If you're a good researcher, I hope, you think of research as a constant process of learning. The beauty of participatory practice is that you're learning together and you're acknowledging that learning process all the way through. If what we're using it for is just simply to regurgitate our research, then as someone very close to me said recently, who come to an academic conference and they're not an academic, and they said, why do people just stand up and read their papers? I can read their books. I can read their papers. Now, we had an argument about it in the nicest way possible, and I talked about nuance of voice and needing to see the whole person, all of that. But they did have a really important point. If we only see podcasting as a space where we repeat what we've said in a book or research paper, that's one thing. And it's a way of telling the world what we're doing, and it's accessible, fabulous. Books are expensive. But let's not pretend that's much different to an audiobook or to reading the book yourself. Whereas, and this is what I remember Chrissy and Chris saying to us right at the beginning, a podcast is different. A podcast is a space of exploration, a space of discussion, a space where we bring ourselves into it and we think together and we learn from that. And through that broadcast, we enable others, hopefully, to learn with us through that process. So I don't know if that answers your question, but for me, that
great.
Feels what
That's
my
really good.
learning's been.
I love it. I think this is a really good jumping off spot because we are actually going to have an interview with Chrissy where she's going to talk about research podcasts and a bit more about how they teach researchers as well as students and other academics about using podcasting. And then when I'm in Leeds for EPOD, I'm going to join you, Abigail, and Chrissy.
Jealous.
We're excited.
In the studio we're talking about, so we can really kind of explore that environment a little bit more. So
Neil's going rogue without me.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, poor Jen.
We're going to shake the leads.
It's going to be so I think this is a great jumping off place. And thank you so much for joining us today on this episode, Abigail. And I'm looking forward to meeting you in person and getting into that studio you were talking about as well, too. That's great.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to participate.
Thanks.
Well, Jen, love that conversation. Really got a lot out of it.
My key takeaway was they never want to do video and they have a really good reason for it. And, I do think there is a place for video in podcasts. I think some podcasts thrive in video, but for this particular podcast, she says that this medium is for audio and she really wants you to think and listen to it. And she doesn't want you to see this particular podcast. So I thought that was
Yeah, totally. So damn you, Spotify, for having your algorithm push video.
Damn you. And that our podcast is never going to rank on any.
Yeah. Well, if anyone got to the end of this episode and they heard me say that,
there we go.
That's my biases. I'm sorry. A little thing I just want to mention to the audience here, behind the scenes, no one knows what's going on, but we've been trying this new technique in our interview process where we run for about 20 minutes for the first part of the conversation. And then we have a break in our conversation and our interview. Kylie, our producer, pops back up on the screen and we talk about did we miss anything in what we just talked about? So we were able to kind of review that with Abigail. And then we talked about the rest of the interview and what we want to cover or whatever. And I got to say, Jen, I really like this new process. So many previous interviews that we've had, I've come to the end, I've got, oh, I forgot that, or oh, I wish I'd done that. And this little break where you kind of like take a time out from the interview and the conversation and you think about what did we just talk about and what do we want to talk about moving forward is like just, it's been mind blowing for me. I've really enjoyed the process. So there you go. Not about this interview per se, but sort of some behind the scenes stuff that we've learned that I'm quite thinking is working quite well.
But the thing that I liked, it actually naturally flowed into the rest of the conversation when we stopped it. So we stopped around the mark about talking about video, and then it naturally led into a better and deeper conversation. So I thought it was really cool.
Jen, why don't you read us out?
Sounds good. Thank you for tuning in to the Continuing Studies podcast, a podcast for higher education podcasters. We hope you found this episode informative and inspiring. If you enjoyed the show, we encourage you to follow and subscribe to our podcast on your preferred platform, so you'll never miss an episode. But if you found this episode particularly valuable, please consider sharing it with your friends and colleagues who also might be interested in higher education podcasts. We also invite you to join your peers on higheredpods.com, where you can connect with other podcasters in higher education and learn from others in the field. Thank you for being part of our community. We look forward to continuing to bring you valuable insights and conversations around higher education podcasts. See you in the next episode.